Hi, my name's Heather DeLacio. I use they, them pronouns, and I identify as a person with lived experience of concurrent cannabis use disorder, culminating in an early episode of psychosis. You know, growing up in a small town as a neurodivergent queer young person, definitely had some difficulties making friends. So when the option arose to use substances as kind of a social catalyst and kind of a way to define myself, I very eagerly jumped on it. But I didn't reflect very hard on the fact that I had been suffering from mental illness since early adolescence, as early as like 4th grade. I was also bullied, so I think that probably played into that a little bit, being young and eccentric and high energy. It was a lot for people sometimes. So I think when I started smoking weed, it kind of dialed things back and it made me more palatable, which I wish I had known that I didn't have to do that and that I shouldn't have had to use cannabis as a way to make myself more palatable for other people, and that if they don't like who I am when I'm not using drugs, that they don't like me, and that's fine, and I can find people who I do get along with. That being said, I do think I had social benefits from using cannabis, and it did help me make friends, but it got to a point where it defined my identity so much that I couldn't separate myself from my cannabis use. And it also got to the point where it escalated. I was using cannabis all day, every day. I was smoking bong. I was using edibles. And then I think from general life transition anxiety as well, because it was right before 12th grade and I had to make these big decisions that really, because of my kind of flawed sense of identity, were struggling with. And so then I had a bit of a psychotic break. I was struggling with issues of like personality and identity and who I was, and feeling like I wasn't really a person anymore. And I began having hallucinations. And the people in my life became unrecognizable because of the hallucinations. Like, I would look at them and they looked different. People's faces just looked warped, and I didn't know how to cope with it. And I tried to explain to my friends what was going on, and they didn't really understand, and they thought I just couldn't handle my weed, which was kind of a lame response from them when I needed support. But yeah, I ended up ceasing my cannabis use completely because I assumed that it was playing into the hallucinations and delusions that I was experiencing. But then when I stopped, hard stop using cannabis, it really, I think, kind of escalated the psychotic episode that I was having. And then I ended up needing to be hospitalized. How that played out was this kind of increasing paranoia, delusion, and hallucination and break of reality, to the point where I was scared to be alive. And I'd experienced suicidal ideation before that point, but it was different. It was like, I'm sad and I don't want to be alive. But this was a different type of suicidal ideation. This was like, I'm scared to be alive. Like, life is terrifying all of a sudden. Like, I don't know what's going on. It feels like I've taken psychedelic drugs and I haven't. It's like the worst bad trip that I never signed up for. And I wasn't using drugs, and I was like, I didn't know how to stop it. And because of the education that I had received about how cannabis causes schizophrenia, and there was no distinction between psychosis and schizophrenia and what that actually even means, I assumed that I'm schizophrenic now. This is all my fault because I smoke weed, and I should probably just kill myself, honestly. And that's how it escalated. That's how it culminated. I had tried to go to the hospital prior to a suicide attempt and to get admitted, but they didn't really understand what was happening, and they didn't take me. And then I called a suicide hotline, but they also didn't know how to reply to I'm scared to be alive, because it was different than what they, I think, are used to, which is just that I'm sad and I'm struggling with this and I'm struggling with that. And I think it's really frustrating to think about the fact that I had to get to that point before I was able to access mental health services. This was 6 years ago, and I'd like to think that it's getting better for people now, but yeah, that's how it happened for me. What I think I would have benefited most from at that worst point in my life, what it felt like, would have been support and understanding from the people around me, and as well as more of a knowledge base around what psychosis is and what it looks like, and that it isn't always permanent and that you can get better. But that's not the way they approached the conversation, or the way that they had approached the conversation of cannabis and psychosis with me. It was always like, this is the worst thing that could happen to you. If you use weed, the worst thing that can happen is that you will have a psychotic break. And it happened. And then I'm like, fuck, now what? Don't know what to do, feel very helpless, feel very isolated, feel very alone, don't know what's going on. Yeah, so I guess I just wish that I had known that there was hope and that it wasn't going to be permanent, so that I didn't get to the point where I felt like I had to kill myself because I didn't know what else to do. And I'm grappling with this idea of like, would my parents rather have a kid that's alive and hospitalized in a psych ward for the rest of their life, or would they rather have a kid that's dead? And that was what I was thinking at the time, because that's all I understood was the outcome. That's all that I thought could happen. So, yeah. I think stigma played a huge role throughout the entire experience of my cannabis use and the culminating psychotic episode that I had, because there was this kind of these different levels of stigma, right? There's the societal stigma of, not talking about mental health and psychosis and these difficult things, because if that wasn't there, I would have known that my uncle had had a psychotic break when he was a teenager. But we didn't talk about that. I didn't know. And then there was this systemic stigma of me trying to access mental health supports and them telling me that I couldn't unless I stopped smoking or using drugs, when I felt like I needed that in order to do what they were asking me to do. Then there was interpersonal stigma from my teachers telling me that I was a waste of potential for smoking weed every day, and not prioritizing my mental health when I was just coping the best way that I knew how with the means that were available to me. And then there was stigma from my peers of other people who use drugs, because I was the one that couldn't handle my weed. And meanwhile, they were using LSD, they were using ketamine, they were using cocaine, and they were having no problems, but I couldn't handle my weed. And they definitely were not sympathetic whenever I started to have like hallucinations and complaining that I thought I was having cannabis withdrawals. And then they're like, you can't withdraw from cannabis. You can't get addicted to cannabis. Like, we don't know what you're talking about. Like, cool it, you're gonna be fine. And that was not the support that I needed. It wasn't supportive at all. And then all of this really culminated in an internalized and compounded self-stigma that I had, and this shame for what happened. And I think if it wasn't for that, I likely wouldn't have got to the point where I felt like I had to attempt, because I would have felt any semblance of hope or self-reliance and self-esteem that it was worth getting better, or not even letting it get to that point. But yeah, I think stigma definitely played a huge role in my experience. I've been very fortunate to channel this kind of traumatizing experience into this passion for advocacy around substance use and mental health, specifically in youth populations, because that was one of the ways that I learned how to cope with what happened. I remember sitting in the psych ward after I was hospitalized and just reflecting on like what happened here, like what went wrong, what could have gone differently, and trying to shift the blame from myself and onto like the larger system that failed me and let me get here. And I had to kind of look at it like, if it had happened to someone else, what would I think? I wouldn't think this is your fault. I would not think that. I would want to comfort this person. I would want to say, someone failed you. Like, this isn't your fault. Mm-hmm. And it's not all on you. And there is a community around you that you might feel like isn't there yet, but it is, and it's going to get better. And you can turn these difficult experiences into something positive, because that's what I did. And I got involved in advocacy, and I started looking at drug policy and criticizing drug education the way it was. Got involved with Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, great organization, got to meet so many like-minded drug policy and harm reduction folk, got to learn so much and just take so much opportunity, because people want to hear from people with lived experience, whether it's researchers or decision makers and policy makers, or if it's other people with lived experience in like a peer-to-peer setting, and just being heard and understood and feeling this kind of camaraderie of like shared trauma and being like, yeah, that happened, but yeah, this is where we are now. So yeah. That's a good question. This is something that I've wondered, because psychosis was such a one-of-a-kind experience. That makes it sound like good, but it wasn't. Like, I'm someone who had also experimented with psychedelic drugs, which can cause hallucinations and can cause your brain to work differently. And it was kind of comparable to that. It did feel like I had taken a psychedelic drug when I hadn't. but that's where it ends, is that it wasn't a choice. Like I didn't, like when I've taken psychedelics, it wasn't scary because I knew it was a roller coaster that I was getting on and that it would pass. But that wasn't the feeling with psychosis. I was like, I didn't sign up for this. I didn't take anything to feel this way. And I don't know if this is going to end. And I feel like this is never going to end. And I feel like this is my life now, and it's terrifying. It kind of just like rocks your whole reality. And sometimes it starts to feel more real than your reality even was before. And you're like, how does this make sense? Like, how does nobody realize that this can happen? Like, it's really hard to put into words. It's like an ineffable experience. Like there's no words really to explain what happens. And I think it's also a very individual experience, because I think that the delusions that you experience are coming from a place inside you. And it's this manifestation of like your own worst fears, like your own personal hell essentially is what it's like. Like I felt like my brain had turned to mush. And I remember looking at the TV after getting brought home by the police and feeling like I couldn't even absorb what was happening on the TV, and just thinking like, wow, I'm gonna be in the psych ward and I can't even watch TV anymore because my brain's broken. Like, great, like this is just how it is now. And yeah, it's really scary whenever you can't look at people because the way that they look is scary, and feeling like, how come I never realized people looked like this before? Like it's not like you can rationalize that it's not real. Like it's very real. But then it's also a delusion. And yeah, it's very complicated, I think. But I would probably describe it as like your own personal worst experience. Like if all of the targeted advertisers managed to pull like your worst fear and create this thing that was like, this is your worst experience. Here you go. That's how it felt. And I remember thinking too, like, I wouldn't wish this on like my worst enemy. Like I hope nobody ever has to go through this. And yeah, but then still people that I know close to me have also gone through it. But it gets better.